Hi, my name is Paul, and I'm continuing my commentary series on Jordan Peterson's biblical series, and I'm just up to number 2 now, and I'm doing a little sub-series on Genesis chapter 1 on chaos, and I wanted to touch on chaos in the temple because Peterson doesn't talk about the temple at all in Genesis 1, and that's understandable because there seems to be no temple in Genesis 1, but really, as I'm going to show you, the temple is pretty central to this passage. So this is what he talks about when he touches on Genesis 1.
Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. And I like that too, you know. I did a lot of counseling work with people who were, coaching work, I guess, with people who were fairly spectacularly successful, and they were usually workaholics. You know, they're the sort of people that were like, they'd work 80 hours a week, just nonstop. That's just what they were like. And one of the things we were always trying to figure out was, well, how much should you work? Because one answer is you just work till you die, right? I mean, you just exhaust yourself. And, well, that's not a good idea. And then you have to figure out why that isn't a good idea. It's got to be something like this, is that you don't want to do so much work that the amount of work you do interferes with the amount of work that you could still do, right? Because if you work like mad for 2 weeks and then you have to lie in a hospital bed for a month, that obviously isn't very productive. So you have to figure out how much you can work diligently and then how much you have to recuperate so that you can get back up and work again. And you know, people have basically settled on something like this and given it the divine imprimatur. That's one way of thinking about it, which is, well, you can toil away for 6 days, and no wonder because you have to work, but you should rest at least 1 day out of 7, because otherwise, well, you don't appreciate life. That might be part of it. And plus, I think it's more a matter of iterability, you know, because one of the things that defines morality is the capacity to repeat something, right? So if something is properly structured in a moral manner, then you can do it over and over and over again without any degeneration. And so that's kind of like a relationship. If your relationship is negotiated, you can continue to negotiate it, and then you can have a relationship that lasts for a long time. You can do it today and next week and next month and next year. You can maintain it across time. And this, I would say, is the wisdom that's been garnered over God only knows what period of time, to say, well, look, I mean, even God needed to take a break and appreciate what was going on, and it's not such a bad thing for people to follow that pattern. And that's
Now let's touch on this, because this is very much, if you're a contemporary North American and you read this passage, this is the frame of reference with which you will approach this. But obviously, if you want to read this text, one of the things you need to consider is what was the frame of reference for the original audience? What did the author intend for his audience to understand about that? Now, one way into this is asking the question of 7. Now, Peterson basically says, well, you know, over time they figured out that 7 was good. But 7 is a weird number, because here's the thing. In almost everything, you have a cosmological precedent for a cycle. For example, a year is one go around the sun. That's a year. A day is one rotation of the earth on its axis. A month is one lunar cycle, but Peterson doesn't say so. Well, maybe just over time we figured out how long this would be. That's not the point of this, because there's no precedent in nature for 7. And so then the question is, well, what is the optimal number of days to work versus rest? But even in Peterson's view here, he doesn't really get into what the goal of work is. And you know, even God had to rest. That's not really going to cut it, especially as you continue on through the conversation about rest, because in fact, in the Bible, rest is a very important thing, and this business of the 7th day is a very important thing. In fact, this business of the 7th day is the climax of the story. Now, back to a little bit of John Walton today. Without hesitation, the ancient reader would conclude that this is a temple text, and that day 7 is the most important of the 7 days. In a material account, day 7 would have little role, but in a functional account, as we see it, it is the true climax without which nothing else would make any sense. Deity rests in a temple and only in a temple. This is what temples are built for. We might even say that this is what a temple is, a place of divine rest. Well, the question is, do we mean rest by laying back in the easy voy and putting our feet up? That's not really what rest is in the Bible. Divine rest in this case is actually settling into the work that God has prepared him for himself to enjoy. And the work will actually be about glory and fruitfulness. And the goal here is that creation functions. Now what Walton gets into, and we're going to also take a look at a New Testament scholar named G.K. Beale in this, because they're making the argument that what temple really is cosmos. And this entire narrative in Genesis 1, creeping a little bit into Genesis 2, is the story about God setting up the cosmos. And as we've talked about, cosmos is an ordered environment that is fruitful and that is constructive and where human beings can flourish. And what Walton notices is that in some of the ancient Near East texts, a temple is built as the conclusion to the cosmic creation. In other words, you begin kind of with this pre-cosmic chaos, and what the deity does is sets up the cosmos, and the goal of this is in fact temple, and temple is the embodiment of this, because in fact for the ancient world the cosmos is in fact a temple, and so therefore the physical buildings that were set up in the ancient Near East were microcosms. These things had a function within the temple. If you travel, for example, to Sausalito, California, just outside the Bay Area, you will find the Bay Area model. And that is a fun thing to visit, because back in the 50s, before you had computer modeling, if they wanted to find out the hydrodynamics, now one of the things that they were thinking about considering in California before wetlands were really on the map was they were considering bottling up basically the San Francisco Bay Area to keep all that fresh water in a huge inland dam. And so in order to see what the impact of this model would be, they made this giant model of the entire water system of Central California. And you can visit this in Sausalito, and it's great fun because they left the thing and you can watch the tides come in and out. Well, that model is in some ways analogous to what temple was to cosmos. And so when we read Genesis 1, we're reading about a temple, and when we read Genesis 2, we're reading about the garden of the temple, because remember, it's a garden. And they think of, say, the palace of Versailles, and you think of the Lord in Genesis 3 walking through the garden in the cool of the day. We might think of Nebuchadnezzar and his hanging gardens, these gardens he built for one of his wives who was homesick for the mountains. Babylon sits on a floodplain, and it's flat as a tabletop, just like the Sacramento Valley. And so Nebuchadnezzar builds this garden for his wife, and this garden is inhabited with plants and animals, and it expresses the king's glory, and it is for the king's enjoyment. Although, as Walton makes clear in his books, one of the real key differences between the Egyptian and Babylonian accounts and the biblical account is that in the biblical account, quite clearly, the earth is made for the flourishing of humanity, and humanity isn't simply kind of a side creature is there to do the bidding of the gods. So cosmos is a temple in the ancient world. And again, G.K. Beale has actually written a number of books on this, and the most technical of them is that the temple and the church's mission. I haven't read God Dwells Among Us, but I would imagine, as often biblical scholars do, they write a technical book to make their exegetical point, and then they'll write a more popular book that will help lay people in the church. Now, in case you don't believe me, have you ever asked yourself, why did ancient peoples invest so much of their GDP in these buildings? If you think about the relative wealth, and Peterson makes this point in other videos, the relative wealth of these ancient people, this must have taken an astronomical amount of their national product to build pyramids, to build temples. Now, this goes all the way into the Middle Ages, and it isn't only until the modern period that we start investing in things like dams and skyscrapers, and these new buildings for us reflect our values, but these buildings in the ancient world reflected their values. Now this wasn't just self-expression to see what we could do. What we have to do is get our mind into their worldview and ask ourselves, why were these buildings so central to their empires? Why were these buildings a matter of national concern to the degree of probably spending something similar to what, say, the United States spends on defense? Why were these buildings so crucial? Well, one of the things that Beale points out is that even the construction of, this is a diagram of the temple of Solomon's temple. Now, one of the things that you see is that the outer court, here the outside the temple, this represents, in a sense, habitable space. Now, you might say, well, what about that? I always wondered as a kid, why is this big wash basin called the sea by the Hebrews? Well, it's called the sea, and then what is the altar? Now, the altar is also called, in some ways, the center of the earth. So here in the outer courts, you have the sea and the dry land. So that establishes, what we have here under the firmaments. If you go into the holy place, in a sense, what you have are the heavens. One of the interesting things that Beale points out is that there's a word in Hebrew that is used in Genesis 1 for the lights, the sun, the moon, and the stars. Now, they're called sun and moon and the stars, but in Genesis 1, they're called the lights. And through the rest of the Old Testament, the only other word this word is used for in Hebrew are the lights on the candlestand in the holy place. So this outer court represents habitable earth where human beings dwell. This inner space, the holy space, is in a sense the heavens, and then the Holy of Holies is the place beyond the heavens, the place where God himself dwells. Now, one of the things that Beale and Walton point out is that in the Bible, these things come up again and again. Isaiah 66, heaven is your throne, earth is your footstool. The buildings of temples was described in cosmic terms. You can read that in Psalm 78:69. And again, this is comparable in the other civilizations of the ancient Near East. Temples were described with cosmic functions. The closest example is Ezekiel 47, where the river flows from the temple. You remember Peterson mentioning that Eden is a well-watered place. Well, what you find is that water flows from the temple, and you're going to see this again in the book of Revelation. Temples are understood as models of the cosmos and were replete with cosmic symbolism. In fact, if you look at the decoration of the temple, of Solomon's temple and the tabernacle, you'll see that these are all filled with motifs that both connect with the Garden of Eden and also connect with the heavens and God's sanctuary. So you have seraphim and cherubim and fruit trees, and all of these things are the images of them are in the temple, even with the Hebrews, who are told to have no image of the God himself. Cosmic origins were sometimes associated with temple building, not attested in the Hebrew Bible unless the association is present in Genesis 1 as Walton has proposed, and I think Walton is exactly right here. Temples could be understood as representing the world, Isaiah 61, and deities rest in temples that have been constructed precisely for this purpose. So in other words, you have the 6 days, and in the seventh day, when it says God rests, it basically means God inhabits his properly functioning cosmos. The world in its great array has been set. He goes into his temple, and as N.T. Wright says, the temple is the control room of the entire cosmos. And in that sense, then, the Garden of Eden, which is also called in the book of Ezekiel, God's holy mountain, which is something that is also used of Zion. Here now, finally, God has made his creation. It is fully functional. It is good. Everything is in order. Now, one of the things that we talked a little bit about last time is that it's very interesting because some chaos elements remain in the creation, and you can see down here the Leviathan, the sea monster, and here is creation, and it's all fully functional, but there's there remains the sea, and there remains the darkness of night. And so what this really intimates, and this is in contrast to, let's say, as I pointed out in the last video I did about John Walton, that chaos is not eliminated from this picture of creation, but the image is that the Lord harnesses and controls chaos. Chaos is not a threat to the Lord. That in all of God's creation, he allows elements of chaos in for whatever reason he chooses, because in fact what you'll see throughout the rest of the Hebrew scriptures is that God will in fact harness these elements of chaos. And as we go through the story, you'll see elements of chaos at Sinai: thunder and lightning and earthquake and dark clouds. Sometimes the violence of God is an outbreaking of chaos. And in fact, when you have the serpents attacking the Israelites in the wilderness, a snake is put up on a pole. Now what's with that? Well, again, we're dealing with images of chaos here. But at the end of Genesis chapter 1, actually the beginning of chapter 2, we have a properly functioning cosmos, which is in fact itself a temple, and the Lord dwells within his temple, and everything is good, and the man and the woman are image bearers of him. And perhaps I'll do a brief excursus on that at some point, because image bearing is a pretty important thing, and everything is set up to run. But now what happens in Genesis 3, when you have what's often called the fall or the rebellion, is that you have a divorce between heaven and earth. You have a layer that goes between heaven and earth. So heaven and earth are estranged, and the man and the woman are cast out of Eden, but God remains on his throne in heaven. There's a separation between them. What I call below here is the age of decay. But yet the goal then in the longer story of the Bible, when you get to Jesus, for example, in the Lord's Prayer, in the Sermon on the Mount, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So the entire flow of God's redemptive purpose is from heaven to earth. In a sense, it's an invasion of reclamation of a rebellious earth from heaven. Now this gets brought into the picture bit by bit as the Bible develops its story. For example, here in the desert wanderings, Israel comes out into the desert, and the tabernacle is at the center. And again, you have the Holy of Holies, you have the holy place with the lights, you have this area with the sea, which is the place for ceremonial washing, and you have the altar, and the camp surrounds it. And in fact, the entire motif of Leviticus and the law given in the Pentateuch is about holy versus common, and clean versus unclean, and all the tribes, as you can see, are arrayed around the tabernacle. And again, the idea is that, in fact, this is a remaking of the earthly temple that gets lost in the rebellion. And one of the things that, when we talk about Genesis chapter 2, one of the things, it was just a couple of years ago, I noticed why Eden is in a sense the temple's garden. And the exile from the garden and sends humanity into this realm which is still gripped by chaos. And in the curse of the man, it's you will till the ground where there are thorns and thistles. So in other words, humanity is going to have to wrestle with chaos. Now, image bearing is not eradicated in the rebellion. The man and the woman continue to be image bearers of God, but they live within this zone where they are royalty, but they are fallen royalty, where they are within the creation, and they're going to have to wrestle with the chaos of creation, because creation won't simply submit to them. And hopefully when I finally get into C.S. Lewis and his book Miracles, when he talks about miracles, C.S. Lewis will talk about the relationship between nature and our wills and the Lord's will, and how, in fact, in a sense, what happens in our rebellion is that we rebel against the Lord, and nature, who ideally was supposed to be in submission to us, rebels against us. Now, what you might understand is that in the ongoing march of technology, we have continued to gain more and more mastery over nature, but there are all these questions. Every time we gain mastery over nature, it seems that nature comes along and gets us again. And I think the entire question of climate change and what we've done to this environment fleshes this out, that the more we try to gain control over nature in a domineering way, the more nature finds ways to rebel. And so this is again the story of the Bible, and you end with a new heavens and a new earth, but you actually don't get an altar until Genesis 4. Well, why don't you get an altar until Genesis 4? Well, that's with Cain and Abel, and in fact the altar is the center of the conflict. You don't need an altar in the garden. You don't need a temple in Genesis 1, because the creation is the temple, and the garden is already a part of the temple complex, and this is in fact where we have direct communion with God, and it's not until you have the separation that you will in fact need an altar, because fundamentally what an altar does is connect us up with the Lord who is in his throne room. And if you read the Bible, you read all of these stories about this pleasing aroma that the altar is. And if we get into the book of Leviticus, you will see that in fact, in many ways, the fire on the altar, which is lit by the Lord from the tabernacle, the entire framework of the sacrifice is you take the animal who is a substitution for sin, and he goes into the Lord who is a consuming fire, and he is wholly consumed. And that is an image of us in our rebellion coming into the presence of God, and we are wholly consumed by his fire. Now, is fire chaos? Or is fire a manifestation of wrath? Or is fire purity? And in symbolism, you see that a lot of these images overlap. And so what in fact Israel will be the one place where, in a sense, the clouds are parted, and Israel is to embody within the earth what the function of what the creation ought to be. Now we're going to get into the question of, okay, well, what do they need for that? They need a temple below, one which mirrors the temple above. And so what, in a sense, this entire sacrificial system, the creation of the tabernacle, the creation of the temple, is in a sense to facilitate this invasion of God, to show the world the way the world was intended to be. Now there's lots of elements in this as the story gets going. God meets Moses in the wilderness, and as I mentioned before, the wilderness is kind of a dry land chaos that's in some ways comparable to the watery chaos of the seas, and there is a burning bush in the wilderness, and again, now the fire, that has some connections with chaos, but the bush is not consumed by the fire. And that, in fact, is a picture of Israel, where this God who is wholly dangerous to live with lives in the midst of these people. And in fact, the entire Pentateuch, these first 5 books of Moses, are all about the question, can this holy God live in the midst of this unclean people? Can the people be cleaned up? And that's the dramatic tension of these first 5 books. Now, Egypt is itself, if you read, say, Brueggemann's commentary on Egypt, he makes it quite clear that Egypt is a watery place. And if you remember the story of Moses, Moses gets placed in a basket into the waters, and that's where he's plucked from by the daughter of Pharaoh and then raised in Pharaoh's court. But Egypt is watery, and you have a sense of, and we'll get into themes of empire later, but you have the sense of water and chaos and empire, and then they go into the desert where life can't be had, but as long as God is with them, manna falls from heaven, and we're going to get into the 6 days you'll pick up the manna, on the 7th day you won't. So what is that rest about? Is that rest merely about trying to get as much work in as you can, or does that rest symbolize something more significant? So if you actually notice at the beginning of the Exodus story, when Moses first starts going to Pharaoh, his original demand is that the God of the Hebrews has called his people to come out into the desert to worship him. And it almost sounds like, can you give us a couple of days off so we can go out for a worship service? Pharaoh isn't buying it. He's not letting his workforce go. And what's more here, he's not letting his workforce worship on the Sabbath. He's not letting his workforce enjoy Sabbath. He's not letting his workforce find their seventh day rest. So then God meets Israel face to face, and Israel can't stand it. And as you know, and God here is, as I said before, the picture of creation, chaos is not abolished within it. The sea and the dry land are side by side. The day and the night are side by side. And if you read, for example, the book of Job and other Psalms in the Old Testament, Leviathan remains, and Behemoth remains, and the jackal remains. But these are all in the vision, not, in, say, mortal conflict with the Lord, but in fact chaos is at his disposal. And later on, when the temple gets destroyed in Jerusalem, it's these chaotic forces of Babylon, of empire, who in the book of Daniel get depicted as sea monsters that come out of the sea, but then the Ancient of Days comes and settles them immediately. So in fact, the picture of the Lord in the Bible is this God who in fact can employ chaos at his service, sometimes to punish his people, but often to purify them. One of the most repeated images in Scripture about what God does with chaos in us is he refines gold with fire. And the New Testament makes this point again and again. And so in a sense, you have chaos comes into our lives to refine us, to purify us, to make us into pure gold, which in fact has glory. And one of these videos, I'm going to get into this theme, obviously, of glory. So the Lord comes down on Sinai, and God is, as Peterson's always talking about chaos, and I'm finding that a very apt pastoral term to use. But God is the master of chaos, and he employs it. The Lord is a consuming fire, and fire comes down on the mountain, fire and clouds and thunder and lightning, and the mountain has to be fenced off, and the Israelites are warned, if anybody comes near the mountain, you will surely die. And in many ways, the tabernacle, once it's built, is kind of like bottled lightning, because you'd better not mess with this God, or he might break out into the camp. And here's the thing, when a holy God comes into contact with a rebellious people, little people fry, because we simply can't take God at full volume. Now this is a really hard thing for us to think about, and I'll just touch on this briefly now, something I want to get into further, that I think Tim Keller has some good illustrations of this. For example, if you're a big time piano player in your high school and everybody in your town loves you, and then you go to New York City to the best music school you can, what you find is that everyone there is talented too. And in fact, there are people more talented than you. And you might in fact have some of the grip of what was in the movie Amadeus, where Salieri recognizes the brilliance of Mozart, and suddenly you have a question. Will you, in a sense, worship the gift that Mozart has? Or will you, in fact, envy the gift? And this is the difficulty we have with God. If God is actually all-powerful and all-beautiful and full of glory, how do we react in our ego selves to that glory? We probably hate it, which is the root of all envy. So the tabernacle then becomes a portable Garden of Eden in the desert. And Israel, in this desert, which is a land of chaos, where there can be no life, the Lord gives life in the desert. And you'll find this theme in Isaiah 35 and innumerable other Bible passages where the Lord brings life into chaos. And again, pastorally, this is such a potent point, because pastorally, again, one of the things I appreciate about Peterson is because he's a clinician, and he deals with regular people and their problems. And people are overwhelmed by chaos regularly. And so as a pastor, well, what can you say with them? Now, one of the things that, again, I want to get into at some point with Peterson is, for Peterson, I'm thinking about doing a video on Peterson's God. For Peterson, he leaves open the question of the ontology of God. And that's something that I know that I've had a lot of discussion with in Facebook and in some other places in the comment section. What is the ontology of God? Well, here's the thing. Chaos comes in your life. Now, one thing that you can use is wisdom, because with wisdom you can control chaos. You can manage chaos. You perhaps won't be subdued by chaos. And in fact, wisdom is personified in In Proverbs chapter 8, and this is connected with the Logos and with Christ, those connections are there, but it's often the case that in my ministry, people are faced with chaos that is going to kill them. People are faced with chaos that they might be able to gain some wisdom in coping, but the chaos will consume them. And then you have to ask the question, what hope can you offer? What hope can you offer the parent of someone who is a terrible alcoholic that is probably drinking themselves to death and will likely die homeless and alone, frozen on the street? What hope can you offer from the chaos of that situation for that parent? And so as a pastor, these are the kinds of things that I deal with. And sure, where we can gain wisdom to help people clean their rooms and fix up their lives and not be subject so much to chaos. The truth is, we live in the age of decay. Everything we build will be taken down. Every life we start will end. Every love will begin will be either separated by resentment or death. And this is the situation that we live. And so what can we do with all of this chaos? So the tabernacle is, in a sense, a portable Garden of Eden, and God's presence makes the camp holy. Well, the tabernacle is holy. The camp is supposed to be clean, and the world out there is for unclean. And so you have all these interesting laws in Leviticus where there's clean and unclean, there's holy and there's common, and all of those laws have everything to do with temple and chaos and order, all within the frame of the culture of the ancient Near East. And this is also a representation of Israel's spiritual state. Can a holy God live in the midst of an unholy people? And the sacrificial system is the nexus. And I mentioned before, at some point, probably when Peterson starts getting into the sacrifices embody the idea of the fire, who is the God, and the animal, who is the substitution for the man. The man brings the animal to the altar, lays his hand on the altar, and in a sense, the sins of the family are transmitted through the patriarch onto the animal, and the animal goes into the fire. And then the aroma goes up to God, and that's, in a sense, the logical system of the sacrifice. And again, at some point, we're going to have to get into the questions of ontology and representation, and that's a really big issue I really want to get into. And part of the reason I'm doing all these videos, because I'm working out for myself the relationship between ontology and representation. So what you find then in the book of Deuteronomy is very interesting, because often we moderners read the book of Deuteronomy, and on the surface, the book just looks like karma, because God says again and again, if you follow my law, I will bless you. And if you rebel against me, I will curse you. And if you follow my law, you'll be healthy and things won't wear out, and everyone will, your wives will have many sons, and your animals will produce, and your fields will produce, and you'll never have drought. But if you rebel against me, then the enemies are going to come in, there's going to be drought, the land isn't going to produce. And this again gets into what happens in the rebellion, where in a sense it's God, humanity, his viceroy, and then nature. And when we rebel against God, nature rebels against us, and then we have this situation of conflict. And so one way to read Deuteronomy is that when we rebel against God, nature rebels against us. But how does temple fit in there? Well, the point of the temple is the embodiment of an ordered, functioning cosmos. And in a sense, what the temple does with all of the function in that is keep the cosmos in order for Israel. And that's why the temple is so central, because if the temple isn't functioning, or if Israel is out of alignment with the temple, and in the book of Ezekiel, which I'm handling right now in my adult Sunday school class, and if you're interested in those videos, you can go over to my church YouTube channel, and you can find that via my church webpage, or in the About Me in this YouTube channel. But Ezekiel very much deals with the question of, well, if things aren't right at the temple, then things won't be right in the nation. And that's because basically what happens with the presence of God is God, and again, the Logos, the Word of God, if this is not in order, then the land can't be in order. And in fact, the language of the Bible is, if you rebel against me, the land will vomit you out. In other words, and we kind of have the sense of Jonah's fish here, Israel has to maintain order, and the temple is crucial in that picture for the maintenance of order. And now the problem of Deuteronomy, again, if you read it like a book of karma, is suddenly you have tension with post-Reformation theology. Protestant theology has various workarounds for this. But if you understand the book of Deuteronomy in the light of the temple, now they don't have the temple yet in terms of the narrative order of the book of Deuteronomy, but it's all pointing towards there. Temple and law and order are both chaos harnessing devices. And it's interesting that when God comes down on Sinai, he gives the law. And so you have this alignment between our image bearing, the temple, and the law. And they all work together. And the scheme is that in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew scriptures, that if humanity is working all of this, then humanity will flourish and life will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Now, the covenant, in fact, and we haven't talked anything about the covenant, and it'll be interesting. Peterson doesn't do a lot of talking about the covenant in his treatment of Genesis, but the covenant administers a relationship. The covenant isn't actually a relationship. It administers the relationship because Israel cannot do temple without the law. And in fact, if you read the prophets, if you read Jeremiah, if you read Ezekiel, if you read Isaiah, if you read Amos, if you read Joel, I mean, all of these prophets are basically saying you can't do temple if you don't do the law. And in fact, later on when the temple is destroyed, what happens with the Jewish people is that, in fact, law replaces temple. The difficulty you have, though, with law is we can't fulfill the law. And even if you dial the law down into 600 some specific commandments, and this is essentially what Jesus treats then when you get into the New Testament period, that even if you fulfill the letter of the law, you may violate the spirit of the law. And this is a lot of what Jesus gets into, in fact, in the Sermon on the Mount. Deuteronomy is fully restored temple in terms of law and covenant, and it leads to a fully restored creation and garden. And so when you read the book of Deuteronomy and you read all these incredible promises about everyone will dwell in the land and everyone will be secure in the home and their neighbors will not raid them anymore and their children will grow to be old and you just have this picture of not nirvana, because that puts us in a different space. You have a picture of utopia in Deuteronomy, and it's all because of the relationship between the presence of God ordering creation and Israel following the law. And so in a sense, Deuteronomy is a picture of utopia with the warning, if you violate this, you will in fact have catastrophe, and that catastrophe is pretty much normal life on planet Earth. Now, one of the things that gets very interesting is that Israel, in fact, is a little bit different from the other nations when it comes to the prophets. And again, I got this out of one of John Walton's books. Here's a compare and contrast between, for example, the oracles of Israel and their prophets versus the oracles of the other nations. Israel's indictment oracles are far more common than the ancient Near East oracles. Most of the prophets for the pharaohs and for the Babylonian kings, they're pretty much yes men. And they pretty much agree with anything the king says, and that's exactly their job. Their job is to provide spiritual cover from the gods for the king. And so they always agree with the king. Israel's prophets are like this group apart that are almost always condemning the kings and calling the kings to account according to the covenant and the law. So Israel's indictment oracles are far more common than the ancient Near East oracles. Israel's oracles most often call for covenant faithfulness, while ancient Near East oracles most often call for ritual faithfulness. In other words, and you see this again and again in the Old Testament, Israel's oracles will say, keep the law, and be kind to the poor, be good to the stranger, keep the moral law, whereas the oracles in the ancient Near East are all come to the temple, give the sacrifices. And now in a cynical view of that might be, well, those priests wanted to get paid. But in terms of their view, well, you have to do these rituals in order for the gods to be happy, which is why they built the temple, in order for the nation to flourish. And so, in fact, if you play a computer game like Age of Mythology, you get all these little worshipers and they've got to worship the gods, and that brings spiritual power. It's very transactional. But in the Hebrew view, it's quite a bit, it's different in that, it's the God's desire to share his blessings with his people, but he can't share his blessings with his people because of their rebellion. So ancient Near East prophecy, divine support is most often in focus. We need the God to help the king. In Israelite prophecy, divine disfavor is most often in focus, in opposition to the status quo. Ancient Near East prophecy often majors in ritual prescription. You have to do the rituals right. Israelite prophecy holds covenant accountability rather than ritual accountability, and the prescription is presumably the remedy, the prescription of covenant faithfulness. Israelite hope is often offered after the judgment. And again, I'm going through the book of Ezekiel now, chapter by chapter in my adult Sunday school class, and we repeat these things over and over again. The oracle comes from God. In fact, last week's Sunday school lesson, God is tired of them. They have failed the covenant. The entire project is up in the air. Israel's a complete failure, but God will come in the end, and he will do himself what Israel is unable to do, which of course sets up then the story of Jesus. Ancient Near East prophecy functions in a context of immediacy and urgency with no long-term value. In other words, the prophets of the Egyptians and the Babylonians, we have to do this right now so we can get our stuff right now. The Israelite prophecies are very long-sighted. Well, God is going to judge you now, and things are going to be horrible for a while, but in the end, God is going to hear the cries of his people and rescue them, and then his prophecies will be fulfilled, and the people will be able to keep the law, and finally, God's vision for the restored cosmos will be in order. Ancient Near East functions in a context of immediacy and urgency. While Israelite prophecy sometimes offers future telling, it is more interested in revealing God. Its goal is the people of God and offers a vision of the person and plan of God. Ancient Near East prophecy usually serves to legitimate the present king. So this is what we see in terms of compare and contrast between Egypt's prophets, Babylon's prophets, and Israel's prophets. Now again, Israel is supposed to be the Garden of Eden revisited. You have the temple, you have the presence of God administered by the covenant, you have Israel via humility, but Israel can't pull it off. The temple gets destroyed. Now Israelites in the book of Jeremiah say, well, God can't touch us because the temple is here, and Jeremiah says, yes, he can. In fact, he will let his temple be destroyed because what you are doing is ruining his reputation, which is supposed to draw the rest of the people of the earth to Israel. Now the temple is rebuilt, but it still doesn't work. And even removing formal idolatry isn't enough, which of course sets up the story of Jesus. And here in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus affirms the law. He demonstrates its demands and our insufficiencies to fulfill the law. And appropriate sacrifices now revisited, appropriate sacrifices in a sense embodied in us. Now this is set up in the relationship between covenant and ritual and moral law and ritual. In other words, if you're a good Babylonian, yeah, you should be moral, and you have the Code of Hammurabi, and you should follow that, and the king will do some of this. But what the gods really want is the payoff. You've got to give the deity their food. You've got to give the deity their offering. You've got to do this, and then the deity will bless you. Well, what the Lord of the Bible wants is, in fact, it's obedience. Obedience is, in a sense, the proper sacrifice. And one of the things I appreciate about Peterson is this progression of action, representation, and then in a sense the physical representation as in an animal sacrifice then gets re-represented in a in a theological representation and, in fact, a much more fully orbed representation. In fact, all of the groundwork for that and all of that is in both the Hebrew scriptures of what Christians call the Old Testament and what Christians call the New Testament. And then now what happens with Jesus, though, is Jesus changes the temple conversation, because Jesus curses the fig tree outside of the temple, which is in a sense declaring the end of the temple. When Jesus is crucified in the Gospels, the curtain in the temple is torn, and basically Jesus replaces the temple, and then the church, the name of my own church, Living Stones. Jesus is the living stone. We are living stones, and this then becomes a temple. In other words, the church functions as temple, not in terms of a building, but in terms of the people functioning in line with fulfillment of these promises in the Hebrew scriptures. Now you see this. Well, you might say, well, what about this rest business? Because God stops work, and then you have the Sabbath rest. Well, how does this work? Well, Hebrews chapter 4 gets into this quite a bit. And Hebrews chapter 4 is, in a sense, a sermon on Psalm 95, verses 10 and 11. God is complaining, "For 40 years I was angry with that generation. I said, these people whose hearts go astray, and they have not known my ways. So I declare an oath in my anger, they shall never enter into my rest." Well, what does that mean? Why that word? They shall never enter into my rest. You see, the seventh day is, in fact, the day in which God enjoys the fruit of his labor. Now, if you think back to manna, 6 days you shall labor unto all your work. So they're in the desert. It's the land of chaos, and God is going to bring life to a people in the desert where there shouldn't be any desert. Again, this is powerful in terms of pastoral work, because people do live in chaos. And part of what I promise them is that God can bring life in the midst of chaos. Now, obviously, we're going to get into cross-bearing and crucifixion and why it goes dark, which is, again, another chaos motif when Jesus is crucified, why there's earthquakes, why graves are open. You find this all in the Gospel of Matthew. Well, it's because right there, this imagery of chaos happens at the crucifixion. And again, if we get into other themes in the Old Testament, the Bible is full of these themes. You have the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord, when Jesus is crucified, is chaos. So, back to the desert, and Israel in the desert. They get out in the desert, they're like, we don't have any water. Well, Moses has to strike the rock, and water comes out. We don't have any food. Manna comes down. And well, people are smart, and so manna comes down. It's like, hey, I'll grab a bunch of this stuff. It's all over the place, and I'll store it for a few days, and that way only one day a week I'll have to go out and get manna. And so the Lord said, get enough for just one day, and that'll be good. So they go out, and a bunch of smart people get enough for 3 or 4 days, and the next day they go to their little manna, they go to their manna jar, and what do they discover? It's all full of worms. Like, oh, this manna doesn't keep. And so, okay, they think about that. And then the Lord says, now on the seventh day, it's a Sabbath. I don't want you going out, so collect double the manna. And all the smart people say, no, I worked this. I'm a smart person who's looking at nature, and I'm doing science, and I figured out this manna stuff, which manna means what is it? This manna stuff only keeps for one day. So those who didn't obey the Lord on the sixth day go out, and they only collect enough for manna, and on the seventh day, no manna fell. Well, why not? Well, because the Lord was, in a sense, resting. And so this entire desert wandering is all about training Israel some relational things. And again, once I get into Jordan Peterson ontology and representation, or Jordan Peterson's God, we're going to have to get into this question, because all of this stuff is relational training. Well, what does that mean in terms of God? And is there a God? Again, I don't want to. These are where my mind is going, and I'm thinking, one of these days I'll have to do a video on Jordan Peterson's God. How does ontology matter to this conversation with respect to both narrative and wisdom? So, the point of rest is in fact shalom, which is the Hebrew word for peace. And when you get into the Gospels, what you'll find is that there are a lot of when I was a college student, you're away from home, you're reading the Bible for the first time for yourself. Nobody's making you go to church, and so at college, I'm free from my parents, and I have to decide. Okay, there's this Christian stuff. My parents gave it to me. What do I want to do with it? So I thought I ought to at least read the Bible for myself and have my own thoughts about it and give it a listen. And then I start reading the Gospels, and I find all these stories that Jesus is fighting with the people about things I didn't really care about, things like Sabbath observance. And I'm thinking, who cares about this Sabbath observance? Well, can Jesus heal on the Sabbath? And again, I'm thinking in terms of karma and legalism, but the point of those stories is Jesus healing on the Sabbath embodies the Sabbath rest. So, and this is why, in fact, traditional Christians like me, you have your worship, your day of rest on the Sunday, because that is the day that Jesus rises from the dead. And that begins to play in interesting ways to these questions of what is work for? What is rest for? Why is there a work of rhythm and rest? I forgot to mention, I guess, way earlier, that where do we get the number 7 from? I've got a theory, and the theory is you have 7 lights in the tabernacle and the temple. Those 7 lights, again, correspond to the 7 lights that are in the sky for the Hebrews. And you might say, no, there's stars like the sand of the sea. Yeah, but the 7 lights are probably the 5 visible planets and the sun and the moon. And you find the lampstands and these 7s in the book of Revelation. And, at some point I'm going to draw the Genesis representation, and I guess I could do it now. And I usually have a whiteboard for this when I teach my Sunday school class. But in a sense, so you have the temple in heaven, you have the earth below. You had Eden, which is my holy mountain. Zion becomes my holy mountain. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, the book of Isaiah. And so what happens, in a sense, is that life comes down in the ancient world from heaven to earth, which is, of course, the purpose of astrology. Everyone assumed life came from heaven to earth. Now again, in the fall, there's a divorce between heaven and earth. And but in terms of what happens with Israel, is that God makes a way with Israel, and the nations are supposed to come in to Israel. And then we get to the book of Revelation. See if I can find myself in this thing again. All right. We get to the book of Revelation, and Revelation chapter 21. Revelation chapter 21. Let's open up a Bible. Revelation chapter 21, you have a new heavens and a new earth. And in the then I saw a new heavens and a new earth, for the first heavens and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. Now again, this bothers people because they say, well, I like the ocean, but what's the point? In creation 1.0, chaos is beneath the sovereignty of God and managed by him. And now with the rebellion of humanity, we then become subject to chaos. And I call this the age of decay. Paul calls this subject to the wrath of God in Romans chapter 1. But in creation 1.0, you have day and night. And so you have dry land and sea. And so chaos and order, chaos is in a sense built within order. And it's only in our rebellion that things get out of order. So then again, you go to Revelation 21, and there is no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. Remember, things come from above, down below, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be their God." We are back to Genesis 1. We are back to Genesis 1 and 2. We are back to the tabernacle in the midst of the people. We are back to the temple on top of Mount Zion. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and will be their God, and he will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things, creation 1.0, has passed away. He who is seated on the throne says, I am making everything new. This is, again, the resurrection. And he said, write this down, for these words are trustworthy and trustworthy and true. And then he talks about the Alpha and the Omega. And then you have the New Jerusalem. And if you look to chapter 21, verse 22, I did not see a temple in the city. Now again, why is there no temple in Genesis 1? Because the cosmos is a temple. Why is there no altar in the Garden of Eden? Because they don't need one, because there is no separation between heaven and earth. So you go into the new city and there's no temple, because the entire new creation is a new temple. The city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of the Lord gives its light. Again, we're back to Genesis 1. You no longer need functionaries. You no longer have day and night. Now the glory of the Lord means it's always light. There is no more darkness. The nations, now these are the non-Jews, the nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their splendors into it. Last Sunday I talked a little bit about Isaiah 60, the wealth of the Lord being brought into Jerusalem. On that day, its gates will never be shut. Why do you have gates in a city? A city has a wall around it. Why? To keep the chaos out. The gates are always open because there's no longer a fear of chaos in the book of Revelation at the end. On no day will its gates be shut, for there will be no night there. There's no sea, there's no night. The glory and honor of the nations will be brought into it. Isaiah chapter 60, nothing impure. We're looking back at the law in the first 5 books. Nothing impure will enter into it, nor will anyone who does what is shameful or deceitful, but only those whose names are written on the Lamb's book of life. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and the Lamb. And again, just as we've seen before in the Old Testament, in the book of Ezekiel, water flows from the temple and waters. And this is why Eden is a well-watered place, because they are in the temple and the water is flowing into Eden. On each side of the river stood the tree of life. And now that's a beautiful picture, because it's like tree on each side, the one tree. So you have, again, the picture of the tree. And again, pay attention to Jordan Peterson's, image about trees in mythology. Trees, in fact, in the book of Ezekiel, there's one very interesting parable about trees. But tree of life is on both sides of the river, bearing 12 crops of fruit. That's fruit for every season. There's no longer any dead time where the people are hungry and waiting for the new crop to come in, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the trees are for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be any curse. This is the curse from the garden, or any other curses. The throne of God and the Lamb will be in the city. And in fact, that is the definition of a temple, where the throne is, where deity rests. They will see his face. This is something you couldn't do. Moses wanted to see God, but God puts him in the cleft of the rock and only shows him his back while he declares his name. Exodus 32, I believe, off the top of my head. 32 or 33. There will be no more night. Again, it's repeated. They will not need the light of a lamp or the light of the sun, for the Lord God will give them light, and they will reign forever and ever. This is the point of the temple. This is why Genesis 1 is a temple text, very much in keeping with all the other ancient Near East cultures. These are some of the ways in which the Bible takes this conversation in the ancient world and modulates it. And this is the way that the Bible takes this conversation from Genesis 1 all the way to the end of the book of Revelation and works on these questions of chaos. And again, I don't think we can have the conversation about chaos and order and blessing and fruitfulness without temple. And that's why I wanted to make this video, and I hope it was helpful. I'm going to start again working on some of the other biblical series as I did from the beginning, where I'll run some Peterson and I'll give some commentary. I've heard from a number of you that that's something that you'd like, and so I'm thinking of trying to work through some of that in a more, I'm still trying to figure out my work video life. I've talked to my church about these videos, and they're my boss. And they have blessed me to continue to do more videos, and so that's good. And obviously my church pays my salary, and so this is, you know, I work, they are my master and I am their servant. So I'm going to continue making these videos, and I'm going to continue to doing the commentary on the biblical series. I'm going to pause and do some excursus things when, for example, like the temple is a theme that needs to be brought out. We're going to have to talk about the image of God. There are a number of other themes. Peterson hasn't talked about glory, and glory is a critical theme, and I think glory is something that holds the whole biblical story together, so we're going to have to talk about that. And then I'll have some other one-off videos probably responding to things that happen, similar to what I did with the lying pastors. A number of people who live in Sacramento have come to me, and I've had lunch with a number of you, and that's been great fun. We're talking about doing a Sacramento meetup group, and if we pull this off, news will follow that later. So again, leave comments in. This is a longish video. Hopefully I'll have some more shorter ones too. And let me know if this was helpful, and let me know what about this was helpful, or what about this you didn't like, because I learned from both comments. Now, obviously, if you say I didn't like this, it doesn't necessarily mean I won't do it, but I do listen to it and take it into consideration. And so far, I think I've been able to keep up with the comments and respond to a number of them, and respond to a number of you who have sent me emails and such. And again, if you live in Sacramento, keep an eye out for the meetup, and I'll put something here on the channel, and we'll see where this goes. So thanks for watching.